Hello everybody and welcome to another video of me sat here at my desk, not outdoors, which has made me very displeased. I'll explain at the end of the video why I'm indoors, but suffice to say it's at least in part because it's raining again. Anyway, this video is about composition. Now, I get asked about composition a lot, and well, it's one of the hardest things to grasp in photography, I think. It's well worth putting the effort in though, because I'd suggest that if you get to a point where you're happy with your compositions, then you're probably 80% of the way towards being happy with your photos. And that's not a scientific number, I've completely just made that up. But suffice to say, it's a big part of the puzzle. Composition is a massive part of the photography puzzle. So what I thought I'd do in this video is go through four kind of questions really that I ask myself every time I'm thinking about composition. Now this isn't the right way to do things, this is photography. Photography is an art, therefore there is no right and no wrong, as I've said before on this channel. This is just some of the things that help me, and hopefully one or two of them will help you. Right then, so thing number one that I like to ask myself with regard to composition is, what do I want to include in an image? Now I appreciate that sounds like the most obvious thing you'll ever hear on YouTube or anywhere else, but it's important. So typically, particularly with beginners, what I notice is that when they take a photo or they want to take a photo, they'll notice what they think is a subject, and then they'll only focus on the subject. And by focus, I don't mean autofocus, I mean zone in on. And they won't pay any attention to anything around the subject that may or may not be included in their frame. And the thing is with photography, if you want to tell a story with your photo, then yes, you need a main character, the subject, but you also need sub-characters. You also need other people or things around the subject to help bring a story together if it's going to be any good, with the exception of one thing which I'll go into in a minute. But for the time being, before I contradict myself, you need other stuff around the subject in order to tell a good story. And because people don't pay enough attention to what's around the subject, typically what they end up with is distractions or things that don't complement or support the main subject. They just pull the viewer's eye away from the main subject. And if you intentionally include things that do support and complement the subject, then that can make a massive difference to your images. And that's certainly what I try to aim for. So for example here, I was very intentional in that I wanted some cotton grass in my frame. I wanted the van, obviously, which is my subject in the frame. I wanted some mountains. I wanted a little bit of sky too. It's a very simple frame, but this is just a simple explanation of what I wanted. In this one, for example, a shot that I use all the time when I'm demonstrating photography things, because I just love looking at it. It's one of my favourite photos. I wanted the boat, but I also wanted the stormy water, I wanted the mountains, and I wanted a little bit of sky too, and that informed the way that I framed my shot. Now, I approach photography in the way that I think kind of fine dining chefs approach their food. In other words, you know when you go to a restaurant and you get heavily overcharged for a meal, and then the food turns up and there's basically, well, there's nothing on your plate. But what is there is amazing. So there's very little of all the ingredients, but they're all incredible ingredients. And that's kind of what I aim for in my photos. I like to basically get as close as I can to my subject while including the supporting and the complementary elements to that subject. As usual, I have no idea if any of this is making sense, but I kind of waffle on, upload it to YouTube in the hope that it'll help some people. Here's another example where I wanted to include a few different things in the frame, but I tried not to include too much of them so that they didn't distract from the subject. So for example, I wanted to include a bit of the sky, because the sky was quite interesting that day, and I also wanted to include this bit of foreground here to add some depth to the image. But had I included too much of those, then the subject would have got too small. The subject's the car and the lights on the road. The subject would have got too small, and there would have been too many distractions away from that subject, and the photo would have just got a bit confusing. So yeah, fine dining is how I like to approach my compositions. Just including a little bit of some support elements so that they complement the subject, but not so much of them that they distract from the subject. That's one of the things that I'm thinking about. With one exception, actually, which I will demonstrate now. So, if I end up with a scene which is super simple. Like, there are 0 distractions, there are 0 possible distractions away from my subject. Then in that case, I like to give that subject room, because I know that the subject won't get lost in the frame because there's nothing to distract away from the subject. So for example, you can see that here with the dog in the frame. I'm not concerned that people aren't going to be seeing the dog because of all the distractions in the frame, because there aren't any. Similar story with this image. I'm not concerned that the subject's going to get lost because the sky is not all that detailed, the foreground is not all that detailed, and therefore I can give the subject, which is the iceberg and Ulanak, I can give them room to breathe because I know that people are still going to find what the subject is. And in this kind of scenario, by giving the subject space, you give it context, and you end up a lot of the time with a better photo. Now, it doesn't need to be completely blank backgrounds, it can just be uniform background. So for example, here there's lots of green in the background. So in this case, I don't really mind giving the elephant room in the frame because I'm not concerned that people aren't going to see the subject because there's nothing really super distracting in the frame. If there was like a red post box here, well, in that case, I might kind of chop that out and just hone in on the elephant. But there's no need to do that because I'm confident that people will find the elephant. The elephant in the room. It's not in a room, that's a rubbish joke. Question number 2, as some of you probably won't be shocked to hear, to be honest, is what do I want to exclude from the frame? Which, to be honest, when you get kind of a bit more versed in this, you can just treat hand in hand with what do I want to include. It can just be one question, really. But for the purposes of this, let's treat it as 2 separate ones. With this image as an example. So, as you can see, this was kind of sunset going into blue hour, and the canoe is the subject, and I wanted to frame it within the mountains and the reflection of the mountains. However, I also wanted to include these ripples in the water, and one of the benefits of doing that was that you get the reflection of the colour in the sky. And therefore I decided that I didn't need all that much sky. I could have kind of gone much wider and got much more of the detail in the sky, but because the colours are reflected in the water and you also get kind of a hint of the colour up here in the sky that is included, I decided that that wasn't necessary. So I went in much tighter to the subject, and I think that worked better for the balance of the photo. So I actively decided to exclude a lot of the sky in order to kind of hone in on the colours that you see in the water and the subject itself. And what I find a lot as a photographer is that often it's what you exclude that's more important than what you include. So photography is different to a lot of arts in that you kind of do it backwards. So for example, with painting, you start with a completely blank canvas. With music, you start with nothing and then you add instruments and voices, and I don't know anything about making music, but you kind of add stuff to get the final product. With photography, you already have everything in front of you, and so it's about subtracting and simplifying in order to get something that you're happy with. And in this case, I decided to subtract the sky in order to get what I believe is a better result. Similar story with this one. So this again was Greenland a few weeks ago. And I could have decided to shoot this much wider. I would have got much more of a human element because I would have got the passenger in the seat and I would have got more controls in the car, kind of in the murky shadows. But I decided not to because I decided there was already enough of a human element in the reflection of the mirror, which you might be able to see. I don't know if you can see that on YouTube, to be honest. It's probably not a huge photo, so hopefully you can see that. And it already had all of the elements that I wanted, so I decided to go in tighter than perhaps other people might have. And well, as a result, I quite like how the photo turned out. And just kind of as an aside, one of my favourite techniques for composition is finding frames within frames, if that makes sense. So sometimes I do it in cars, for example, where here the kind of main subject is framed by the windscreen. Same story here, an image I shot a month or so ago in Sri Lanka. This is kind of, you might be able to tell, but this is kind of the windscreen edge, and obviously there's a bus right in the middle of it. It's just a bit of a random aside, but I thought I'd mention it. Question 3 that I like to ask after question 1 and 2, typically, is what kind of lens or focal length do I want for this photo? And obviously I use my answers from questions 1 and 2 to inform that decision. And it doesn't need to be exact at this stage, particularly if I'm using zoom lenses. I can just pick the zoom lens that I think I'm going to need to include and exclude all the things that I want to include and exclude. But basically this is just a lens I'm going to stick on my camera and walk around a site with, trying to find a composition that both includes and excludes the stuff that I want to include and exclude. I mean, again, that's really obvious, but Yeah. And question number 4 is, can I come up with or find a composition that incorporates the golden ratio? So on this channel I've spoken quite a bit about the rule of thirds, and I hate the fact that it's called a rule of thirds because, as I said, it's an art. There are no rules, there's no right and wrong, but it's called the rule of thirds. And I reference the rule of thirds a lot. I always have the grid set up on my camera. And the rule of thirds is basically a huge simplification of the golden ratio, basically. The golden ratio is like 1 to 1.618 or something, and it's all maths that I don't understand, but basically it's lines and squiggles in places that for some reason work well for the human eye. But I find typically out in the field, referencing the rule of thirds and having the grid set up on my screen and on my EVF is a really useful tool for helping me frame my subjects and my compositions. Now, when I'm looking at my photos in post, then things can get a bit more interesting. So, as many of you know, I'm sure, if you're in Lightroom and you hit R, you will be presented with one of the squiggles or lines or whatever that represent the golden ratio. And you can change these by hitting O, and you'll go through sort of a number of them. So that's just rule of thirds. That's another one. Don't know what that's called. That's the golden ratio lines, so that the lines are a bit closer together than they are in the rule of thirds. And you can go through all these. If you hit Shift and then O, you can change the direction of things. But yeah, you may just find that that is a useful tool for helping you crop and frame in post-production. But typically I find that out in the field, the rule of thirds is enough, normally. And so yeah, that's how I like to think about composition. I've explained before, I think, what the rule of thirds is, so hopefully that's fine. Basically, you just want to line up things on the lines rather than just in the center of the frame, so horizons and people, stuff like that. Works well. Typically looks a bit nicer than just having stuff in the middle of the frame. It's cool. Anyway, hopefully that was useful. That's just some of the things I think about when it comes to composition. Yeah. Oh yeah, also, the reason that I'm indoors, other than the fact that it is still raining, is that the books have turned up. My books, your books, actually, really. Thank you so much for your orders. It's been amazing. They've taken a bit longer to get to me than I thought they would. There are a couple of complications in design. And also we're still trying to figure out the last couple of hurdles with shipping. So they're going to be going out a little bit later than I wanted, but they will be on their way to you soon. And I've basically been spending the last couple of days signing them. It's taken a long time, but I really, really appreciate the support. And yeah. I've been blown away by it, to be honest. So thank you so much. Can't wait to get them out to you. They'll be out to you soon. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, as I say, again, hopefully that was useful, and I'll see you soon, hopefully soon, outdoors. Cabin fever is a real thing. Oh yeah, also, thank you for your birthday messages last week and your well wishes. That was really appreciated. I'm still dressing like a child. See you later.